would have much preferred to have continued to hear Carl speak, and I'm just yeah, amazed by his presentation, and I hope to follow that up a little bit with our NT perspective. So I'd obviously like to begin by acknowledging the Larrakia saltwater people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work in Darwin, or Garramilla, as they call it. So we pay our respects to the elders past and present, and to all First Nations people. And we extend our respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which others are joining us from today. And we would also like to acknowledge any First Nations people present for this conference. And I'd like to personally acknowledge the previous presenter, Carl, for his powerful presentation, and thank him very much for sharing that. We acknowledge that this was and always will be unceded land. So I'll just begin, pull up my little slides, won't be a moment. Sorry, I'm just trying to get that. Okay, can everyone see?
Yep, all
sharing?
good.
Yep. Okay,
Yep.
perfect. All right, so I'm going to start today just by giving a bit of an overview of CDU, just a bit of a unique institution here, and provide an overview of our HREC. So I'll touch upon how the CDU HREC both views and reviews First Nations research proposals, and the guidelines that we've developed with our committee, for our committee, to ensure consistent review of First Nations applications. I'll then touch upon the challenges that we face with recruiting and maintaining First Nations representation on our HREC, and how we propose to improve upon this moving forward. So, a little bit about CDU. We are a unique institution in that we serve a large area in such a remote location with such a small population to sustain it. With our NT campuses located in Darwin, we also span a diverse footprint from capital cities such as Perth, Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney, and to our regional hubs of Alice Springs, Palmerston, Katherine, and our remote locations in Jabiru, Tennant Creek, Yulara, as well as on country. So CDU is the first dual sector university offering both higher education and TAFE courses, and we're the only university based in the Northern Territory. So the Northern Territory spans approximately 1/6 of Australia's landmass, and yet is home to only 1% of the population, of whom 30% are First Nations people. So CDU works in partnership and collaboration with First Nations peoples, our communities and industries. We are a national provider with expertise in online and flexible delivery, and our reach for delivering high quality, relevant and life-changing training, education and research extends throughout Australia and beyond. So our 5 core values here at CDU are courage, kindness, openness, innovation, and leadership. So although we're a relatively small university, CDU places high importance and value on research and research impact. As such, CDU's ranking in this area of research is higher than expected for a university of our size. So we're currently sitting the top 300 universities globally for research and impact towards all sustainable development goals, which is something we're very proud of. And also 28 of CDU researchers are in the top 2% of the most influential researchers in their field, which again just shows the, as our Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation likes to say, that we punch above our weight when it comes to research. So therefore, the role of the HREC is extremely important in delivering good research as well. So CDU boasts 13 research institutes and centres listed here, and that includes the Menzies School of Health Research. So Menzies are responsible for the approval and oversight of health research conducted within the Northern Territory, including clinical trials. We also have the Northern Institute, which was established in 2011 through a partnership between Charles Darwin University and the Northern Territory Government to undertake high quality analysis in social and policy research and build research capacity and leadership in Northern Australia. We also have the Molly Wadagugu Centre, who are leaders in First Nations maternal, newborn and child health. So the vision of the centre is to support women's cultural and birthing aspirations, especially in remote locations, through research and they use this to dismantle the barriers imposed by westernised approaches to birthing and maternal health care. So they do a lot of amazing research out of that centre. So the CDU HREC has jurisdiction over all research conducted by CDU researchers and research students. As part of CDU's commitment to excellence in First Nations research, human research ethics proposals relating to First Nations research require full HREC review to ensure cultural and ethical sensitivities and nuances of such proposals are are appropriately and comprehensively addressed. So in line with the national statement, and the NHMRC ethical conduct in research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities, CDU HREC undertook steps to move towards establishing the requirement of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research agreement, which we call an ATSIRA, or a reasonable equivalent, such as a reference group or evidence of collaboration to be in place ahead of ethical review by the CDU HREC. I'll touch upon this a little bit later, but that agreement, I'll get to that in a minute. So in 2020, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, IATSIS, published the IATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research, which has been given the authority to be a code with underlying legislative leadership in this area. So the code statements of rights to be followed that are complementary to the NHMRC National Statement and Guidelines for Ethical Conduct in Research. So the code applies to academic research and all other research activity in Australia. There is a strong view surrounding collective rights and interests, emphasising that all research, even non-identifiable data reviews and audits, or research that does not require engagement, is scrutinised. The CDU HREC remains committed to increasing First Nations representation and expertise on our committee and upholds the IATSIS code and relevant principles of ethical conduct and the processes of the NHMRC. So action has been taken throughout the past year to address these aims, and we'll continue into 2025 in collaboration with our Deputy Vice-Chancellor for First Nations Leadership, Professor Ruben Bolt, our HREC Chair, and our existing First Nations HREC members and Deputy Chair. So just to show you a brief overview of the types of projects reviewed by the CDU HREC. So in 2023, the full HREC reviewed 48 projects out of 109 new ethics applications received. 26 of these were related to First Nations research, which equates to 54% of what we review in committee being First Nations research. The remaining 61% of applications went to executive review, and these included lower risk applications and reciprocal applications. So of the total applications received in 2023, 29% related to First Nations. As we near the end of 2024, we just had our final HREC meeting yesterday, and the full HREC has reviewed 61 projects of the 130 new ethics applications received, and 27 of these were related to First Nations research, which again equates to about 44%. The remaining 69 applications went to executive review, and so overall the number of First Nations projects we received this year was 28%. So due to the fact that on average, approximately 45 to 55% of our applications that are reviewed by our HREC of First Nations research, it continues to be extremely important to maintain and increase First Nations representation to the CDU HREC committee. So in 2022, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for First Nations Leadership, Professor Ruben Bolt, along with our committee, began developing guidelines for the review of First Nations proposals in line with the IATSIS code to ensure consistency and practicality of review in line with the code. So very briefly, our committee is made up of experienced researchers and external professionals, as well as First Nations representatives. We meet 7 times a year in person and via Zoom, but there are ongoing deliberations and dilemmas surrounding First Nations research, which is why the HREC agreed to work on the in-house guidelines to provide clarity around the review of proposals that involve or are led by, or importantly, may impact First Nations researchers, participants, people, and community. One of our biggest ongoing dilemmas, as I've mentioned, is recruiting and maintaining sufficient representation, and this will be discussed in more depth soon. So firstly, what does CDU consider First Nations research? So we consider First Nations research to be any research that relates to or may have the potential to impact the collective rights and interests of First Nations peoples, land, water, cultures, and histories. When reviewing submissions, we ensure that the applications are always reviewed by the full committee, even if the study is considered to be lower risk. For First Nations research, we also include studies that use secondary data, as the implications of the finding could potentially cause distress or upset if not presented thoughtfully or sensitively. So the CDU HREC application form includes additional questions that refer to the 6 core values of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research under the NHMRC guidelines and ensure that they're addressed appropriately. Additionally, we also ask for the signed HREC, which I mentioned earlier, surrounding collaboration, and very often we like to see plans to assemble a reference group. So collaboration and evidence of co-design is extremely important with the ethics application for our committee. The core values and principles according to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, IATSIS, are Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous leadership, impact and value, sustainability, and accountability. So everyone's probably already familiar with these graphs, but the NHMRC presents the principles in a diagram such as this, where spirit and integrity are as the core values, with cultural continuity, equity, reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. The IATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research is structured around 4 principles, and that's Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous leadership, impact and value, sustainability, and accountability. Now, each of these principles give rise to responsibilities, including recognition and respect, engagement and collaboration, informed consent, cultural capability and learning, and Indigenous-led research. And this is what informs our committee when we review these projects. So justice, respect, and transparency are the principles that our HREC highlights amongst all the others, and certainly not forgetting merit, integrity, and beneficence. But an ongoing conversation for the CDU HREC raises is, what can we do to support First Nations self-determination in research? So our HREC is not rigid in decision-making and do the best to be fair through taking an intelligent, informed, and reasonable approach. To assist us, as I've mentioned, we have developed the ATSIRA, so the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Agreement. So the CDU requests that this agreement be signed by relevant collaborators, stakeholders, and First Nations representatives following thorough and genuine consultation, which is integral to the planning of the research project and to be submitted along with the ethics application. This helps to ensure that all details concerning a study's conduct have been discussed and agreed upon before ethical review, not after. The ATSIRA also serves as a practical document to assist CDU researchers to uphold the highest standards of research integrity, governance, data sovereignty, and ethics for the benefit of all participants and contributors. We call it a template so that it can be adapted by individual investigators depending on the context of the study. So the ATSIRA should be signed by all communities who will participate in the study to ensure that the process towards Indigenous-led research is pursued. And the ATSIRA must be agreed upon through genuine and honest consultation. So it can't be rushed, and it is best if it's built upon existing relationships and kinship. So similar to what Carl was saying before, you need to develop those relationships and earn trust before you can enter into these sorts of agreements, before you can even get ethics. So that's what we at CDU expect. Sometimes there is a reason for exceptions to be made, and the requirement for an ATSIRA may not be suitable. So the ATSIRA, as I've mentioned, is meant to ensure true consultation and shared leadership in all aspects of the research. But there are some times where it may not be required or even appropriate. And that's when the research involves First Nations people as participants who represent themselves, or the research is led or co-designed with First Nations researchers or collaborators, or a First Nations research team working with a community that is not their own. We do require a reference group to be established. Sorry, I think I'm taking too much time, so I'm going to rush through a little bit. So now I'm going to talk about why representation on our committee matters. So as we all know, recruiting and retaining members across all categories is an ongoing challenge for all HRECs throughout Australia. This is largely due to the fact that these are volunteer positions that require a significant commitment in varying capacity. This is particularly the case for academic staff and other professionals who already carry considerable workloads, which impacts on their capacity. Here in the NT, we have a slightly more challenging time given our ever-changing community. We have a very transient community here, and after a few wet seasons, most people decide to leave the Northern Territory. So that's a challenge as well in maintaining representation. But another challenge is in particular for First Nations representation is overcoming the pervasive perception that ethics committees are a roadblock rather than a facilitator of good research and research practices. So in our continued effort to ensure that the CDU HREC is compliant and adhering to best practices, we undertook an external review of our HREC earlier this year. And this provided some great insight and how we could improve upon our practice to ensure best practice. So having viable representation that genuinely enhances and respects First Nations voices in the review process is an ongoing challenge and one that we continue to address. In our ongoing commitment to excellence, we remain committed to increasing First Nations representation. Although we are very lucky to have our Deputy Vice-Chancellor of First Nations Leadership, Professor Ruben Bolt, as a member of our committee, along with our Deputy Chair, Dr. Kat Couttet, who is a First Nations researcher at CDU. In addition to our amazing chair, who was not First Nations, Associate Professor Robin Williams does also sit on the IATSIS Research Ethics Committee and has worked extensively with communities throughout her research career, and as such brings a depth of knowledge and experience to the complexities and sensitivities related to First Nations research. In 2025, we are proposing to establish a First Nations subcommittee who will review all First Nations projects prior to the full HREC meeting. The purpose of this First Nations subcommittee will be to inform and advise the HREC in their decision-making regarding First Nations projects. The subcommittee will be made up of internal First Nations CDU academics, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for First Nations Leadership, as well as recruiting external and community First Nations representatives. So that's, sorry. So the challenges, unfortunately, even though the Territory, where we have 30% of our population being First Nations peoples, recruiting and maintaining representation to the HREC has always been a challenge. We are in close contact with NT Health HREC, so Menzies HREC, and we are working with them to improve upon our representation of both committees. There are a number of challenges that we are trying to overcome, and we believe that these challenges include, and I will hurry up, sorry, Gordon, engagement. So given things like time commitment, as well as significant mistrust and historically negative outcomes of research for First Nations people being subjects of research and not in control. So thankfully this is changing, but it does take time. It takes respect and trust to build back up. One of the other things that we've just, discovered is remuneration, respecting the knowledge and lived experience of First Nations people and what they bring to the table. So the question we continue to ask ourselves is, how do committees and institutions ensure fair compensation for members, particularly in this tough time across the sector? This is a question we don't have the answer to, but we continue to address. And finally, a challenge to overcome is cultural safety. The high level of demand on First Nation members and the cultural load upon those members is something that we continually look to address. So we hope that with the introduction of our First Nations subcommittee, it will provide it will create a flexible and culturally safe space for increased First Nations committee representation. And yes, so I think I will stop there because I think that my time is up. But that is really all I had to say, and I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity today.
Thanks so much, Hayley. There's probably not time for questions, but what I will say is that, because we've discussed this, the issue of how the positionality of the researchers sort of affects the view in the way the ethics committee considers them. And the reason I mention that is because Mandy Downing tomorrow from Curtin University is going to talk about positionality. And I think that's so important because sometimes it can feel as if by virtue of being a First Nations person, there's actually a barrier to research. So
yes.
So, do you have any quick comment on that one? I think it's a really fascinating topic.
It is, and that's sort of, I didn't touch upon it in depth, but that's why we developed the guidelines and we have the exceptions now, because we do have a lot of Indigenous led research up here, and they're just yeah, I just it's not appropriate to ask them for the agreement, and how do you deal with that, and how do you make it fair and consistent? So,
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
and
Well,
sorry,
Hayley,
yeah.
thanks a lot for taking the time, and I really, really appreciate that. It's great to see that Charles Darwin Uni is sort of coming up with these solutions, because clearly the Menzies School of Health Research has their own subcommittee, but for you to develop your own subcommittee, I think is, given the amount of First Nations research you do, is a really appropriate response to whomever reviewed your ethics committee.
Yes.